Hi, good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. Hey. All right, welcome everyone to this afternoon book event and cocktail reception to discuss the newest book by David Hulme, Armando Barrientos, and Joseph Hanlon, Just Give Money to the Poor. Can I see it? So I can show it off while I'm telling you about it. The Development Revolution from the Global South. My name is Jamie Zimmerman, and I can hold this here. Well, I won't. And I direct the Global Assets Project here at the New America Foundation. It's a project of the asset building program focused on creating new opportunities for savings and wealth creation for the poor in developing countries. And I'm not going to say much by way of introduction, because I know the longer each of us talk, the longer we all have to wait for wine, beer, and cheese and such. So I just want to briefly explain why I think that this book and this idea is so exciting. And then give you a little bit of information about the breakdown of the event, and then we'll get started. So why do I think that this is so exciting? Next week, and in New York at the United Nations, there's going to be an anniversary summit for the 10-year anniversary of the Millennium Declaration and the Millennium Development Goals. And while there have certainly been achievements toward those Millennium Development Goals, we're really woefully behind on many, and not a single one of them has actually been achieved. And our goal for reaching all those goals is 5 years from basically next week. So the timing is perfect for new ideas to improve development strategies and poverty reduction strategies. And I particularly like this idea. It's partly because it's a new take on how to do aid, and I like new and innovative takes on new ideas. It's also maybe partly because Ray Boshara, who's the founding director of the Global Assets Project and still a senior fellow with us here in the Asset Building Program, wrote the foreword to the book. But it's mostly because I think that this idea has huge implications for human capital building and financial asset building for the poor. And I hope that we discuss that more today. In fact, the Global Assets Project is currently working with the United Nations Development Program on exploring the prospects for direct delivery of aid, foreign aid, into bank accounts. So this particular topic is of deep personal and professional interest to me. So the breakdown of today's event. So the way that we're going to do this is David is going to present to you on the book for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to have 3 expert commentators come up and give us their thoughts on David's presentation and the idea in general. And then we're going to open up to Q&A for the audience for about half an hour before we head back to the back of the room for some of that wine and beer and cheese that I was telling you about. I want to just remind everyone that this event is webcast live. So if in the audience or the speakers today, if you could just speak directly into the microphone so that those who are watching remotely can hear you. And now I will introduce to you David Hulme, our featured speaker. So David is the professor of development studies at the University of Manchester, and he is the founder and director of the Chronic Poverty Research Center and executive director of the Brooks World Poverty Institute, where he and his colleagues just last week hosted a massive conference on 10 years of war against poverty. He's here in the U.S. over the next week mostly to head up to New York to talk some sense into our friends at the MDG Summit, and we're taking advantage of his presence stateside to hear more about his new ideas and discuss them with all of you today. So David has written dozens of academic papers and journal articles and written or co-written 17 books, including many more as a contributing author on a wide array of subjects, including global development, poverty reduction, finance for the poor, public sector reform, and, of course, the MDGs. When he's not promoting his new book or planning global conferences or advising the United Nations, he's also working on another book, Governance, Management, and Development, Making the State Work, which is due out next year. So without further ado, David.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for coming along this afternoon, and thanks to the New America Foundation for letting me launch the book here. It's really good to be here. And I might press the button and that will give us something. Okay. Let's start off with the beginnings of the book. Some years ago, I got J.D. von Pischke here. I used to work on microfinance, and I sort of didn't think microfinance was doing as much of what I was hoping to do in poverty reduction, so I looked for some new ideas and went through quite a few of them. And one of the ones that really fascinated me was the idea of social protection, which my colleague Armando Barrientos, who's worked on pensions for about 20-25 years, he used to work 25 years ago on pensions for poor people when everybody knew poor people couldn't have pensions, and he persuaded me about the idea, and so I've been working on this quite a bit over the last few years. But we did a book a couple of years ago called Social Protection for the Poor and Poorest, which is a nice academic book and got some good academic reviews. But when we sat down afterwards and we said, what do we do next? We sort of said, well, what we should do is something which is much more accessible, and particularly something that is maybe pointed towards parts of the world and groups of important people who don't believe that you could give money to poor people and they could use it well. And over a glass of red wine, we said, yeah, it's just give money to the poor. So that's how our sort of academic book began to turn into something in which we wanted to use the sort of types of evidence that we had, but to put them into a much more sort of accessible and marketable form. And that's what we've come up within this book. To help us do that, we've been working a lot with Joe Hanlon, who is a lecturer at the Open University, but he has the great advantage of training originally as a journalist, as a science journalist for New Scientist. So he actually kept cutting down all these long, wordy things that we kept writing and putting it into language which we felt would work much better than us trying to précis our academic papers. Answer questions about there are a lot of interesting questions about how academics try to move into more popular domains that we've struggled with. The three of us still talk to each other, though, which I think is probably what we've, in a way, claimed that social protection is a quiet revolution that is coming very much from from what we've called the global south, from developing countries. When you look 10 years ago to the Millennium Declaration, the Millennium Development Goals, all of the, in a way, that activity about poverty reduction at Millennium Moment, then there's barely a mention of social protection or of cash transfers. But now, 10 years later, we've got at least 110 million families in at least 44 countries receiving forms of cash transfer. It's really built up rapidly. I mean, in the book, we talk about 750 million people potentially benefiting because the households are getting hold of it. But in the most recent computation that Armando's done, he says it's just short of 1 billion people because of the rapid expansions in India and in China. But the impetus for the ideas comes very much from the south, from South Africa, Brazil, Mexico and India, rolling out to Indonesia and China and scores of other countries. It's not a donor initiative, although donors are picking up on it now, and that's certainly something that our present work is looking at. Could donors help this idea without actually damaging it? And certainly when I look at Bangladesh, where I worked quite a lot over the last 20 years, about 10 years ago, old age pensions were introduced there by the government, and all the donors decided to keep away from it because it was a bad idea in a government program. But it's gradually been expanding. It's now moving into urban areas, and there's a gradual sort of acceptance that it's reasonably well targeted, and it does appear to be poverty reducing. So this is an idea which sort of tends to have a bit of reverse causality. And the final point here is that you've got to get the techniques right, you've got to design these things well, you've got to manage them well, but you've also got to get the politics right, because you can only give money to poor people in any country if the elites and the middle classes agree that you can do that and allow it to happen. And if you want to think about these programs longer term, then you've got to get the politics right so that they are contributing to some sort of dynamic in which the idea of helping to provide better welfare for poor people is a component of the political agenda. I'll give you the talk in advance because I was sort of tinkering with it this morning. There was a danger that by adding to things you lose it. But I did work out that I had 4 findings, 2 debates and 5 principles to sell. And luckily the 5 principles are still the same ones as we conclude the book with, which is always a great relief when you've just been ploughing through materials. The findings are that certainly the poor people use cash transfers well, often very well. That cash transfer is an efficient means of immediately in the short term reducing poverty. That there are long-term benefits. These are very evident in terms of human development, raising educational levels, raising health and nutrition levels, indications that they can contribute to growth certainly at the local level, perhaps at the national level, and certainly hypotheses with some emerging stories behind them that they might contribute to political evolution, which is more inclusive and less exclusive than is occurring in many poorer countries. The debates are about, finally, affordability, which we don't go into that much in the book, but these programs are affordable. They are not cheap, but they are affordable. The debates are about conditions and conditionality and about targeting. I'll go into these in a little bit of detail later on, but certainly our argument would be that these need to continue as debates, and they need to be national level debates. There's a real danger that there are attempts to find the universal truth or prove the universal truth about conditions being good or being paternalistic, about targeting being a bad thing or being a good thing. But in fact, what we think is these need to be national level debates and worked out at the national level, experimented with and modified. And then finally, the principles. I'll return to those at the end. But these programs need to be fair. They need to be seen to be fair by the people who are receiving them, by communities at the local level. They need to be assured. They only work if people know that the transfers have a medium-term future, perhaps a long-term future. They've got to be practical. You have to find ways of delivering these and of making sure that reasonable systems of accountability are occurring. It's got to be more than a few cents. It doesn't have to be large sums of money. Often for poor households in poor countries, then $5 a month may make an enormous difference, but it probably needs to be certainly more than small handouts. And it's got to be politically acceptable. As we've said, at the popular level, and particularly at elite and middle class levels, then the programmes have to be accepted and supported. Very briefly, just in case any of you are new to it, but cash transfers are payments which are regular, and monthly payments do seem to be the favoured mode. Long term, they're not temporary, they're not short-term social safety nets. They are in a way rights-based and part of a legal entitlement, not charity or not at the discretion of a particular organisation or individual. And tax-financed, ideally financed from domestic taxes, but in low-income countries it's certainly necessary to use some donor resources at the present time, and so these may be transfers, international transfers of taxes across countries. And I suppose the final point to make about the cash transfers and the social protection generally in developing countries is it tends to focus upon social assistance. It's not so focused on social insurance as has been the case in middle-income countries and in the richer world. The common types of cash transfer are non-contributory pensions, sometimes called social pensions, but pensions that people get, but it's not because they've been paying towards those pensions, but it's coming out of a general taxation fund. Child benefits, the biggest one of which is the child support grant in South Africa. Family grants targeted at poor families or very poor families or female-headed families, a variety of different categories there. Disability allowances, and cash for work programs, which is the form that these programs have taken in India with the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Let's go quickly through. I'll go through a couple of examples so you've got a flavour of them. There are quite a lot of examples in chapter 3 of the book where we tried to describe the enormous variety of programmes. South Africa has got two main programmes. The social pension scheme, which is reaching around 2.3 million people, which is about 85% of those aged 63 or above. In a way, it's got a very weak conditionality, a weak targeting to it. It basically goes to anybody who hasn't got another pension, which basically means that civil servants and people with private sector pensions that have been built up over the years don't get access to the social pension. More recent but much bigger is the child benefit, the child support grant, which reaches 8.5 million children, 55% of the nation's children. It's means tested, but there are no conditionalities with it. It simply goes to the mother of the child. That's costing 80 billion rand a year now, which is 3.5% of GDP, which is very much at the top end of the range, which one could think of developing countries affording. And it's partly because of South Africa's failure to create jobs with the limited growth that it's had over the last 20 years, and social protection is incredibly important to reducing, or at least making sure that poverty levels don't rise because of the jobless growth that's occurred there. This has become a sort of regional model, and you can see this model diffusing across southern Africa, and there are now social pensions in Namibia, Lesotho and Botswana. Not transferred particularly by technical processes, but essentially transferred by politicians from other countries looking at what's happening in South Africa, meeting with the ministers from South Africa and deciding, even in very poor countries like Lesotho, that yeah, we can try this, but modifying it so it meets local conditions. Oh, excuse me. If we move on to Brazil, the Bolsa Familia, the family grant, which was in a way created by the Lula administration, pulling together a whole variety of existing cash transfers that were occurring and modifying them, now reaches 11.6 million families, around 26% of the population. It's targeted on families that have got a per capita income of less than 30% of the minimum wage, and there's a whole set of conditionalities around it to do with ensuring that children access health services and start their education off. There's also a social pension which reaches 6.6 million people. Overall, when you put these two programs together, that's 39% of the population, 1.5% of GDP, something between $10 to $90 a month for each family. I've got details about Progressor Oportunidades there, but I'll skip those because I'm sure there's lots of people in this room who know much more about that than I do. And let's sort of go on to what we'd argue is we've managed to condense in the book, which is the results of many studies. And we basically argue that these studies show that the poor use money very wisely, and that they use cash transfers very wisely, and that investment and expenditure is focused very much upon the family. Certainly elites in many parts of the world assume that poor people would squander or waste money if they get access to it, but the evidence really points overwhelmingly to enormous amounts of planning and thought and strategizing going into as to what to do with cash transfers. There are immediate benefits, but particularly the benefits can be charted through to the next generation. Nutritional impacts, so that children are taller and have a higher BMI, which makes a great deal of difference to both survivability chances if anything goes wrong, and also to the types of levels of activity and output they might achieve in the future. Education, certainly improved attendance, improved literacy rates, and a whole series of IQ tests that have been done by one or two programs pointing in that direction. And some evidence, but that's much more anecdotal, about aspirational changes, that this does actually change the types of life trajectories that children may see that they are on. Very little evidence that cash transfers discourage work, and in fact just the opposite. We sort of put this thing, richer and poorer, really different. I don't know whether that's putting things too starkly, but actually I'm trying to work out how to develop this concept in Bangladesh. One of our concerns in Bangladesh with some of the cash transfer and the asset transfer programs is that we might be worried about conspicuous consumption in some rich parts of the world. In Bangladesh, what we're worried with some very poor households is what we call conspicuous investment. It is that households get so much hooked upon getting their cattle and goats and hiring in land that they may actually not start to invest in education or rapidly improve child nutrition as quickly as they could do. And it's us applying our value sets, but it's actually a concern that some poor households are actually so set upon creating their economic assets because they think it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to move forward, that they may actually think about sort of economic investment at times instead of thinking balancing that out with human development investment. But certainly the evidence very positive. The evidence certainly indicating that in the short term, cash transfers reduce poverty. They're used by the whole family, as I've said. Probably the major example that really points that out and can illustrate that are pensions in South Africa. The pensions go to old age pensioners, the majority of whom are women, are grandmothers because of age of marriage and life expectancy of women. But overwhelmingly those those old age pensions are treated as grants for the family and are used for the whole unit. And one does find in some of the longitudinal studies in South Africa that if granny dies, then actually that has a dramatic impact on the welfare of the whole household because of the cessation of the pension. On many programs, then one found around about half of the cash transfer is being spent on having more food and having better food, more varied food, more food with more protein, food with more vitamins in. Children, according to a number of studies, particularly the studies by IFPRI, can actually be shown to be taller 2 or 3 years later from control groups. Health improves, school attendance improves, and more learning occurs. And if one's worried about inequality, then arguments that you can actually see a whole series of inequalities being dampened down, not removed, but being dampened down by cash transfers. That income and consumption inequality, but also access to education and a number of sort of multidimensional inequalities may reduce. The longer term indicates also that there are very positive benefits from cash transfer schemes. One can certainly see these, and again, South Africa is somewhere where the evidence comes out most clearly that the actual stimulus that they can give to the rural economy, particularly rural economies that may be stagnant at the time, is dramatic. That actually it stimulates sale of farm goods, agricultural produce. It keeps local shops going and gives them a higher turnover, and helps to maintain local economies that will be finding things very difficult without this. One finds most schemes that a significant part of the grant, often between 10 to 15% of grants, are in a way invested in micro enterprises, are used in a way alongside whatever savings or loans are available, or help to amplify that. In Southern Africa, then often fertilizer is something which people buy or try to buy to get an increased yield, seeds, but then also non-farm activities, particularly goods for trading. And evidence also in South Africa that it encourages job seeking, but that households that are getting these cash transfers actually are more energetically seeking jobs than those who are not getting them at a similar sort of economic level. Now, hey, I need my research assistant with me to make this work. Never try and be clever with your computer if you're a technophobe, and that. It actually says cash transfers do not make people lazy. And our argument in the book on that is that you cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you have no boots, and that cash transfers in a way can provide the boots and the straps that people can help to improve their position from. They provide a platform from which opportunities can be sought out. That the majority of poor people know how to invest profitably. If there are local opportunities, they know about their capacities and their abilities, and that cash is a key ingredient that they need if they're going to seize those opportunities. And particularly that cash transfers reduce risk aversion. There is a fallback position. People know that if they take a risk to try and increase their income and it goes wrong, well, there is still going to be a small sum of money coming in each month so that one is not absolutely having to beg, but there's a way of keeping the family together. So one can think of new crops, thinking perhaps of taking loans. To amplify on this a bit more, risk is an enormous problem for poor families. Again, referred to J.G. von Pischke, who introduced me to the idea of micro debt many years ago, at a time when I was very worried about the talk about microcredit automatically being good for poor people. But when you talk with poor people, many of them are very worried about taking credit or getting into debt, because if you can't repay it, then a whole set of economic and social sanctions can be applied, and you can really lose out economically and in terms of your social standing for the rest of your life. People have to ask themselves questions if they're thinking of buying a sack of fertilizer, if they're thinking of changing the crop. Will my family go hungry? Will we actually starve if I try a new crop and it fails? Should I risk buying fertilizer? If the rains come, then it's a no-brainer. But often the rains don't come here, so it's a really difficult decision to take. even simpler things like can we afford a bus fare for someone to go and look for a job in town? If you haven't got much money, then that's a major investment. And cash transfers mean that there is a small but guaranteed future income, and that permits risk taking. In a way, it's a form of insurance. It's a substitute for insurance where insurance is lacking. Microcredit, and when we talk about people getting cash transfers, they're often thinking about how they relate their cash transfers to taking microcredit. But they point out the difference is that you've got to repay your microcredit even if the crop fails, even if your loan fails. But they do also point out that if they've got a cash transfer income, they will think more about taking microcredit because they've got a device to repay it with, even if the sort of micro enterprise fails. What are the assumptions, in a way, that we've got to, in a way, think about if we're going to advance these schemes and also think about how to use them in parts of the world where they're not being used? One of the sort of, I suppose, underpinning assumptions is that poverty is partly caused by a lack of predictable income. It's a lack of access to cash that keeps people poor. There's an assumption here that opportunities are available, although there's still a case for cash transfers in totally stagnant economies simply to maintain people, even if the medium and long-term benefits couldn't be achieved. There's a strong argument that the short-term benefits may be worthwhile, but where opportunities are available, then it's much more likely we're going to get the sorts of reported impacts that have occurred. It assumes that the poor can be trusted, that they can be trusted to set goals, and also that they can be trusted to have the abilities or to develop the abilities that will be needed to be able to use cash transfers well, to take the right decisions. And there's also assumptions about whether giving people money is ethically right, whether it's a good thing to do, and whether it's politically feasible. And certainly those things need to be thought about, because certainly in many ministries of finance in Africa, where donors are getting involved in trying to transfer cash transfer schemes quite rapidly, then they're finding that ministries of finance are saying, but is this a good thing to do? Will elites, will the middle class allow this to be done? Do you think we should put the tax aside? There are lots of these questions about political feasibility do depend upon attitudes and assumptions in country about why people are poor. I just thought I'd put this up because actually one of the reasons that we went for the popular book and we went for a US publisher is that we perceived one of the greatest obstacles is in the US, where people probably find it much harder to believe that you could give cash to poor people and that they would really use it on average, and well on the upper side of average, very effectively. And one finds a whole contrast of positions. Interestingly, I mean, the US came at the top on the World Values Survey in terms of seeing an individual criteria, laziness, as being the cause of poverty when you're really pushed into choosing one or the other, rather than unfair society. Germany beat Sweden at being extremely liberal in terms of saying, no, it's our unfair society. It's nothing to do with the individuals. In between, we've got a number of the important countries which are using these schemes to a big degree, and one sees a big difference in public attitudes there. But we think those attitudes are very important. But probably the most significant obstacle are the attitudes in the US, people assuming that attitudes they have about welfare programs here, about the way they think that people would use cash if it was transferred them in inner city Washington, in inner city Chicago, and maybe not appreciating the evidence that's built up and the different contexts that we're talking about. Now, those sort of figures there gave us some ideas about attitudes in a number of developing countries, but certainly things are changing in developing countries, as one can see from the initiative that's been taken in actually implementing at the national level these cash transfer schemes, not when donors and international agencies are saying this is a good idea, but actually doing it as a priority national development program. And in a way, what we certainly have now is this consensus emerging in many developing countries that we must promote growth, but we've also got to focus on human development, and also we've got to think about vulnerability and human security, particularly with what's happened with food prices, as well as the financial crash in 2008, but also going back to the late 1990s and the financial crash of that period. The 1990s financial crash certainly showed many countries, and Indonesia would be a classic example, that belatedly trying to design social safety nets that are designed to cope with a major crisis is just not viable. If you want to be able to cope with a major global crisis, whether it's food prices, whether it's about finance, whether it's to do with climate-induced change hitting some factor, then in fact you need cash transfer schemes and social protection schemes operating in advance, and then you can modify and shift them, as has happened in parts of the world where food prices and finance in 2007, 2008, 2009 have caused problems. Trying to implement social safety nets just after the crisis, you just can't do it. It's just not possible to set up the administrative systems to get these things operating. So unless you believe we're out of a world of crisis, and everything seems to suggest that crises are going to be a norm, even though we can't be sure when, and we can't quite be sure what the next one is, then these attitudes of certain these ideas have fed into many developing countries who don't believe they're in such a the sort of stable growth world of growth that we were promised in the early 1990s. They're also coming from emerging domestic democratic processes. In South Africa, they come out of the end of apartheid, the need to make pension schemes and a whole set of public sector programs fair across races, and also because of the perception that the inequality and that the biased nature of growth needs to be dealt with through public expenditure. Public expenditure, taxing and redistribution. In Brazil, they come very much out of the democratic process, the Cardoso period, and then modifications, but the sorts of promises that Lula has made. In India, fascinating though, I mean, the Rural Employment Guarantee, when you look at it, is Congress Party's response to the rise of the BJP, and it's a sort of secular response to a Hindu nationalist movement. How you actually play in a political democracy, how you actually try to stay in power when you've got a very powerful identity-based group that's on the rise. So these domestic democratic processes are important. The idea that the poor are good economists and good planners is certainly coming through, but also the idea that the poor have a right to voice and that we need to listen to the sorts of programs that they might think work. And finally, in a number of finance ministries now, there are one or two people who will sort of say, wow, this social protection, these cash transfers are quite a tax on GDP, but what are the costs of not having social protection? What's the increase in infant mortality? What's going to happen if we have an illiterate next generation, which is not as healthy? What will happen if we have a financial crisis or a food supply crisis if we haven't got these programs in? So certainly things are, in a way, moving in that direction in the South. Let's move on quickly then to some of these debates. Conditions or co-responsibility. What my friend Armando Barrientos often likes to talk of as the linkages to services. These things vary enormously as to the words that are used about them. Mexico, when we've got high conditionality, people who get access to oportunidades having to ensure school attendance of their children, go to clinics, and even the having to attend lectures about good parenting and about other issues. In South Africa, then, really sort of virtually no conditionality or very limited conditionality. A whole set of different arguments are put up for conditionality and a whole set against it. The conditions for it are that longer term impacts and cultural change will be achieved if conditions are put there, that one will get middle class social and political buy-in to these schemes. And certainly in Brazil, some of the political analysts there who've looked at the evolution of cash transfers say that the conditionalities were essential because the Brazilian middle class and elite were not going to pay tax indefinitely to the poor, but if they believed this was a sort of one generation investment, then they were prepared to make that one generation investment. But also quite powerful arguments against. From the left comes the arguments of paternalism, that actually putting any conditionalities with a program means that you are limiting what poor people can do with it. Also severe problems, particularly in low-income countries, where existing educational health services may be of low quality or very stretched, and so one has to ask the question, well, what will happen if we stretch these services further? Similarly, lots of debates about targeting. and very different responses. In South Africa, the pension is virtually untargeted apart from this no other pension criterion. Child benefit is targeted, though, and on the poorest half of the nation's household. In India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is untargeted, but there's a self-selection process. You have to put yourself forward for doing hard manual labour. So you're not simply asking for a cash transfer because of your status. You've got to actually contribute labour. Ethiopia, the Productive Safety Nets programme, has a labouring requirement, but actually around about 25% of the resources in that programme recognise that many households haven't got anybody who could get involved in a cash for work programme, and so it actually is just a pure cash transfer. There isn't a requirement to do work on it. Went into a bit more detail there about some of the ongoing debates, but these targeting debates I won't go through in any detail, because our argument with those would be it's not an argument about finding a universal truth. It is about, in a way, facilitating those debates at the national level so that the positions that are reached are actually acceptable to domestic political processes and hopefully can contribute to the evolution of longer term cash transfer and social protection programs. The final point, though, to make is certainly that in Africa, one of the arguments that has come up against targeting, particularly in very poor rural communities, is this argument of we are all poor here, and that if you use a targeting criteria, then you'll actually get a relatively random selection of us at the moment, because it just depends on what stage we're at in the life cycle, in the annual cycle, in what's happening to our food supplies at the moment. But in many countries, categorical targeting has proved particularly effective, much easier than means testing, and people find politically that it seems to be more acceptable, particularly in terms of giving pensions. Evidence certainly in Bangladesh that giving pensions is both socially acceptable, but also that the levels of corruption may be lower. Stealing money from an able-bodied man is one thing for a bureaucrat, but taking money from a sick old lady actually makes people feel different. There is a morality to corruption in those ways. The other thing that's been worked with in Brazil are having relatively high cut-off rates, where you have to declare you've got a low income to get access to it. And if you declare it, then you'll get it. There won't be a test, but you've actually got to, in a way, publicly declare it. The 5 principles. Let's move rapidly for those. These are what we finish up with at the end of the book. To be effective in the short term, but to contribute to the evolution of more effective systems at the national level, then cash transfer programs have to be fair. Most systems have to agree that who is getting the grants seems reasonable. They don't have to fully agree with it. You don't need unanimous agreement, but you need to have a broad feeling at the grassroots level, at middle class and elite levels, that this is fair, this is something that we support. They need to be assured. People need to know that they're going to come every week or every month, or in one of the Latin American, the Ecuadorian example, every year. But people need to know these things will come along regularly. Monthly programs seems to be what many countries are aiming for, because that keeps sort of administrative costs at a reasonable level, and it's reasonable. The gaps are not too long for people to cope with. Particularly though for changing behaviours about investment and risk aversion, then people have to know it is going to keep on coming. They've got to be practical. You've got to find ways of delivering these and being able to monitor them and show that you are maintaining reasonable standards and improving the standards that are occurring. But there's a vast amount of knowledge that's been generated over the last 10 years that can help countries that are having difficulties or that haven't really experimented with the programs. Post offices have proved effective in many countries. Mobile phones may just be opening up, using markets, lottery agents, a whole set of different devices that one can look at, and particularly these low-cost identification mechanisms make this easier. Not just cents. There's a rough estimate is that around 20% of a poor household's income is the sort of level of transfer that is required. Something of that nature will make a step difference. If it is actually only 1 or 2 or 3% of household income, then it will be appreciated, but it's a nice little bit of charity. It's not going to make a big difference. And finally, these programs have got to be politically acceptable and, in a way, meet popular needs if they're going to be approved, and also if they're going to contribute, generate an evidence base and support for cash transfers in the future. I've talked about the way that the programs have worked, and that immediate and social protection, and it reduces risk. It increases investment in the medium term and human capital development, stimulates economic growth and investment. It can be a step on the way to national welfare systems, but we don't see these just as programs. We think this is a way of helping poor countries decide, can we actually afford some sort of welfare system? And it may be a step on the way to good enough governance, not to perfect governments that we might have talked about 20 years ago, but to gradually improving democratic processes and improving policies so they meet the needs of populations. It rebalances expert advice about what to supply, what to give poor people, with choices and preferences that come from poor people. The final point then, just give money to the poor, as the book says. That doesn't mean pour it out of helicopters or give it as charity, but it means carefully designed programs deriving from national decision-making processes and experiences and building upon the evidence that's generated. There's a role for this for donors and international agencies. They can support cross-national learning. They need to make sure they don't try to transfer programs, because contexts are very important, and national governments need to know that they are buying into the programs. They're not taking guaranteed programs from anywhere else. We've got to recognise the affordability of these programs and find ways of fitting them to public expenditure plans. Joint financing with low-income countries will be necessary. And in part, I do see a positive side for this for donors and international agencies. Looking at the way that this experience, this evidence has grown out of the South, then it could help some agencies develop their arrogance reduction strategies so that they can get ownership. So you can actually sit down as peers and talk about, so what's the poverty reduction strategy, rather than imposing those from outside through nods and winks about whether money will or will not follow. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. That was a great presentation. I wanted to let everyone know that we do have a small amount of books available for sale, and the publisher is giving us a 40% discount off of that list price that David had on the screen earlier. So they're $17 today if anyone's interested in picking up a book after the event. While our expert panel gets settled, I will take a couple minutes to introduce them. I'm really excited about this diverse panel and what they are going to have to say about this idea, because we have a panelist from the social sector, someone from the private sector, and then someone from the microfinance sector, which I think often straddles both the social and the private. So quickly, Paul Francis is a senior social development specialist in the Fragile States Conflict and Social Development Unit at the World Bank's Africa region, and his current interests include youth conflict and violence in sub-Saharan Africa. His earlier work on poverty and social policy, natural resources management, and decentralization in a range of African and Asian countries has been undertaken while he was at the IMF, UN, and DFID, and other agencies. And he's taught for several years at the School of Development Studies, the University of East Anglia. Julie Katzman is the interim executive vice president and general manager of the Multilateral Investment Fund at the Inter-American Development Bank. Ms. Katzman has over 15 years' experience in private equity, capital raising, and mergers and acquisitions in Latin America and Spanish alternative energy companies. Earlier in her career, she worked for Lehman Brothers, and later as the director and co-founder of the Violi Biorum and Partners, where she advised many large and influential companies on both strategic issues and capital raising. And then finally, at the end of the table is David Rudman, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, currently focusing on microfinance and writing a book on the subject, running the Open Book blog, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's been the architect and manager of the Commitment to Development Index there, which ranks the world's richest countries based on their dedication to policies benefiting the 5 billion people living in poor nations. He's written several papers questioning the capacity of common cross-country statistical techniques to shed light on what causes economic development. And I think we'll just go from there. We'll just go down the line, Paul, Julie, and then David. And then we're going to give David Hulme an opportunity to respond to their comments, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's clear that cash transfers are one of the big ideas of the age, as Nancy Birdsall, I think, commented on this book already, and that people who need money use money well. It seems such an obvious idea that one wonders why it took so long to reach that conclusion. James Ferguson said on that very issue that 25 years ago the idea would have been ridiculous, in fact laughable. In fact, I just remembered as David was talking about his helicopter, dropping money from helicopters, that the first time I worked with him, which was probably about 1990, yeah. He was on a team with us evaluating a project in a certain South Asian country, a certain rural development board, and I think one of his conclusions at that time was that we should have dropped the money from a helicopter. It's good to see that his methodologies. It's good to see that his methodologies have become a little more sophisticated, but it's clear that that things have moved on, and I ask myself, why now? I mean, it's not relevant to the practicalities of it, but it seems to be very relevant to the broader ideological and political environment, which is so important. I mean, one issue is that we now have strong, confident southern governments who've gone ahead with these issues with or without advice from outside, with their own social problems, large countries, large budgets, large inequality, and large social issues. And I think that's a very positive movement that's happened. I guess on the other side, and this is relevant, I think, to the way in which this idea fits with broader social and political change. Clearly, the idea becomes so attractive because the idea of the validity of labor is moving, because there are so many unemployed that it's now one worries less about providing a disincentive to labor. I think this is a brilliant book. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it, but David's given a wonderful introduction to it. It synthesizes, I was very interested to hear of the background to it in terms of involving a journalist. It synthesizes very well and very effectively, and I think there's scope for this model of presentation in much more of our development work. It does it not at any cost to the intellectual rigor of the argument. It does it extremely well, and it's also relatively brief, which I think is a quality. All of the evidence there points, as you've seen from David's presentation, to the same conclusion, that in most cases these programs work extremely well. The book raises the main questions, and to go some way towards answering them in terms of the characteristics of the program. They need to be regular, reliable, practical, and popular. And the impact on production is clearly has an enormous scope for impacting production as well as consumption. But it's not just the book actually about cash transfers. It goes much wider than that, and David's to some degree pointed to those issues, the wider ideological and debates around development, and also about global change more generally. It's a book about perceptions about poverty, perceptions about poor. It's a book about the power structures in some ways that govern development and approaches to development. I'm not sure. I mean, the book claims at one point that it's a challenge to neoliberalism, and I think to some extent that's true. But also, I wonder whether that's always the case. In many ways, these programs, which are low-cost ways of targeting the poor who would otherwise be unemployed and perhaps causing trouble or violence, are quite consistent with dealing with the flotsam of a neoliberal global economy. And one wouldn't want to distract attention with these mechanisms from all the other work that needs to be done to make markets work for the poor who actually are employed, or make employment for those who are not. And of course, the radical these ideas are, they've already to some extent been swallowed whole by the aid industry. The World Bank financing for conditional cash transfers. I think unconditional cash transfers are less established there. It's taking place in at least 13 countries and providing 2.4 billion in the starting or scale-up of such programs. Much of it across Latin America, but increasingly recently Africa is also receiving assistance of that kind. And an estimate I saw for 2006, which must be well outstripped by now, says that 16% of ODA is going towards cash transfers, which actually surprised even me. In terms of the political economy, I don't think it's fair to say that donors have a monopoly on being self-interested and patronizing. Many of the mechanisms which are criticized in this book are very well established within country bureaucracies, within elites. Clearly, they deserve criticism. I think sometimes, as someone said to me, one of the best kept secrets of the international financial institutions is their powerlessness in terms of imposition. The political economy is ingrained. It's not just part of the international, it's also part of the national and local systems. I did feel, and perhaps it's a Joseph, that to some extent the treatment of local institutional issues could have been more nuanced, but I think on the other hand that would have been asking for a different book, and the book as itself is very suitable for a wide audience. The issues of objectives and context, and in fact, to some extent, David's brought them out in his own presentation, are extremely important. Obviously, there's a range of objectives that could be used, and even more important, a range of contexts to which these programs apply. It would be good to see, and actually, I have not had the chance to see David's companion book, but to see more work on what determined those contexts and what determined whether cash transfers should be conditional or unconditional, targeted or untargeted. Certainly, that applies to the very interesting issue of the political economy, nationally speaking, of reform, and how these programs, which clearly need strong political support from the highest level and from the broadest political constituencies, how that is established. Secondly, at the other end, how are households affected? There's an interesting piece of evaluation going on at the moment in Burkina Faso, sponsored by the World Bank, looking at the difference between transfers to men and women within households and what different kind of impacts that has. Those issues, and again, they're touched on a little a bit in the book, will I think be very interesting to see developed in the future. The same goes, I think, for the very important issue, at least on the countries I work in, of capacity in Africa. Capacity for administration, capacity for the implementation, dispensing of the resources to citizens. Clearly, that is often lacking. We need to know a little bit more about what is needed, how it's needed, and in what context. Buy the book, it's great. That's my last word on it. Thank you.
Do we have to turn on? No, we're turned on. Okay. Well, first, David, I too liked the book, and but I do have to tell you that I had to hit the button that said, please tell the publisher to put this book on Kindle, because it's not. And, I don't really read things in paper anymore. So it was a technological. You might want to mention that to the yes, you might want to mention that. I was struck by the blurbs at the back, because as Jamie mentioned, I come from the private sector, and I joined the IDB group about a year ago. And one of the first things I did was to say to everybody, okay, I don't speak development. And you guys write in a way that it's completely not understandable to the rest of us. And one of the folks who works with me is sitting there and laughing, and it's because everybody has changed the way they write a little bit to make it more accessible. So I loved the book for just that reason. It was very clear and accessible to those of us who speak the regular language, shall I say. And as I said, I come from the private sector, and so my take on cash transfers, conditional or otherwise, is, do they work? The bank, clearly the IDB, as we call it, the bank, clearly has a belief that they do work. Over the last 15 years, the bank has done 24 loans for about $7 billion to 13 countries to support primarily conditional cash transfers. And my comments, by the way, will be wearing two hats. The first part will be wearing the hat as the executive vice president of what is the bank, and the other will be wearing the hat of the general manager of the Multilateral Investment Fund, which is primarily a grant-making entity, because we have two different takes on some of this. And so I said, what are the two goals here? And I think David got to that. One is decreasing the poverty of current consumption, and the other is decreasing intergenerational poverty. And I think we in the Latin America region benefit from some of the conditional cash transfer programs that are the oldest, whether it's the reformulated Bolsa Familias in Brazil or Oportunidades in Mexico, as well as others. And so there's a lot of very good impact work that's been done. And the people who designed Oportunidades, one of the architects actually is a senior person at the IDB, were really quite insistent on looking at that, because the concept of just give money to the poor, it is intuitive on the one hand, but the reaction in many cases is the opposite to that. And on the first, decreasing current consumption poverty, the work is really clear that it very much has worked. On the second, decreasing intergenerational poverty, I think the evidence is still out. Again, since most of the transfers were involved in our conditional, what we can see is that enrollment rates are up quite dramatically. Kids are in school. People are going to health clinics. The things that we wanted to make sure were happening. But the question is, what's happening when people are in school? Is anybody learning anything? And I think the word you used was great in the book, which is there's a co-responsibility. If I'm going to send my kids to school, are you going to teach them? And are the schools going to have supplies? And are there going to be schools? And if I'm going to bring my child to the health clinic, is the health care practitioner going to be able to provide some sort of health care that's relevant and going to be additive? And I think that's where we would say maybe not so much in a lot of cases, which means it is a co-responsibility. And it's a responsibility of the governments and of aid organizations and the like to provide the funding to improve teacher skills and provide schools and change the way health clinics availability is. We've somebody who does a lot of work in this area in our organization has done some really interesting work in Ecuador, and seeing the teacher capability, even at the most basic level, that are in the schools where most of the recipients of conditional cash transfers are going, is appalling. And so, we have to work on that if that piece of it is actually going to work. This whole question, I think you're right, it should be a continuing debate. Should they be or should they not be conditional? And in an ideal world, I think they wouldn't be conditional, but what are we trying to do with the conditionality? And part of that is convincing people that the investment in human capital that might, in a perfect world, be quite obvious to them, information, at least in our part of the world, is not that perfect. And so you might need to do something to make it clear that that investment in human capital is worthwhile. Again, have to work on the delivery of services, but still, even with a relatively poor level in some cases of delivery, it's better than not. And I think on the second part of that, which is public policy imperatives, that part of it has been more successful, getting girls in school. Left without conditionality in cultures that are not going to invest, they might invest in education, but they won't invest in girls' education, means that you have to have another tool in your toolbox, and this is a pretty effective tool in that toolbox. The political consensus side of this, I think, redistributing wealth is never easy, and I think the election in this country yesterday makes that quite clear. Latin America is one of the most unequal, it is the most unequal part of the world. This has been a help in actually achieving the political consensus in redistributing some of that wealth. And I think if one tried to do it without condition, it would be very, very tricky. Now, the numbers associated with the cash transfers get sound quite high. But I went back and asked somebody, because I didn't do it, to look at what percentage of GDP the programs that we are involved in represent, and it's 0.25%, which is below the low end of your range. So I think I should have somebody check and make sure that the number is correct. But it has much more bang for its buck than it does have an impact on GDP, and it's only a couple percent of total public sector social spending. So again, they sound like big numbers, they have a big impact, and they have much, I think, more impact than they do relative to the percentage of spending that they're taking up. I'll be quick and just talk for a moment from the Multilateral Investment Fund perspective. And the MIF has been at the forefront of a lot of work that's been done on remittances and unlocking the development impact of remittances. And we, from that side of things, see this as a very large untapped market, as a way to achieve bankerization and savings and financial inclusion. Because much like remittances were these huge flows of money, and therefore if you got it right and you convinced people to enter the financial system with the remittance, you can do the same in conditional cash transfers or cash transfers of any sort. We all know that the poor have very rich financial lives. They just have informal financial lives and often unsafe financial lives and improvised financial lives. But the comment about insurance and savings and needing risk aversion, and this can be a way to increase the stability of the very poor's financial lives. It's interesting, and I found this fascinating. We've just started to do work in this area, and we're designing some projects. But we were talking to one government that is in the conditional cash transfer market, and we started to talk about linking conditional cash transfers and savings products. And they actually believed that when 5% of the population who received conditional cash transfers saved some of the money, that was a failure in the design of their program. Because if they'd gotten it right, all the money would have been spent. And so part of what we see is that we need to work on policymakers to say, it's not that you need to spend all of that money, it's that it can be a buffer. And if it is saved and it therefore can be invested and can create more productive assets, it can really have a quite substantial developmental impact beyond the specific transfer. I guess the last point I'd make is something you alluded to, David, which is the conditional cash transfers or cash transfers are not really good for post-shock transient poverty. Not only because the programs can't get put in place right away, but because, particularly on the conditional side, those conditions are probably already being met by those people. If middle-income people are thrown into transient poverty by a shock, they're sending their kids to school, they're going to health services. And so this isn't the best weapon to combat that kind of shock.
Okay. I don't know about you, but I thought that David's talk was just fantastic. I really found it very stimulating and interesting, and I hope I can just remember half of what I learned in the last half hour or so. So I have almost nothing to say against the talk or about the talk because I just thought it was really good. I'm happy to say that I did actually read the book, and I do therefore have some comments on the book, so I've got something prepared. I should also disclose actually that I have recently asked David to referee a research proposal. Seriously, he's to referee for funding a research proposal that I'm about to submit. And so in some sense, I do have a conflict of interest. So I think
we
actually,
should discount everything.
Sorry, actually, I think the book is perfect. I wouldn't touch a comma. Yeah, so I'm done. All right. I want to mention some of my colleagues at the Center for Global Development, Nancy Birdsall, your predecessor actually, Arvind Subramanian and Todd Moss have done work on a particular angle that connects to this, which is the challenge of preventing the resource curse. So a country discovers oil, Iraq, Ghana. How do you get the money out of the politicians' hands quickly enough, perhaps, so that it doesn't corrupt the whole system and create more Nigerias? And so they've done work and been very interested in the possibility of using direct cash transfers, like in Alaska, to solve that problem, or at least reduce it. One thing I really liked about this book is the way it situated cash transfers in century-scale history. I mean, I learned that the poor laws go back to 1572 from this book in England. And that really made me think. I think the original laws were very local level. Individual parishes were mandated to impose taxes and then redistribute locally. And given that that was a rather singular development, and that England then went through quite singular economic and political developments, one has to wonder if there wasn't some causality there. Of course, it's a very complicated thing. I don't mean to suggest a simplistic theory, but you do have to wonder, and I think the book suggests that that may have contributed in a really important way to the long-term development of the country. And I looked up one of Angus Madison's book. He's a brave man that can estimates GDP in the year 2000, or the year that Christ was born, this kind of thing. And he says that GDP per capita in England around 1600 was about $1,000 in purchasing power parity terms. There are only about 15 countries in the world today that are poorer than that by this measure. So England was about where Rwanda is. And again, not to be simplistic, but it sort of suggests that, as the book implies again, that almost every country could contemplate doing this, just based on that comparison, which I think is really interesting. Now, one thing I didn't like about the book, and which was absent from the talk, was the way that it situated cash transfers in decade-scale history. The book says that this whole idea is sort of a rebellion from the global south against the Washington consensus and the neoliberal ideas about development. And not that there's no truth to that, but I just found that argument was just brought on too strongly, and I didn't find it convincing. I mean, I read a book recently on microcredit, attacking microcredit as being neoliberal. So it's bad to give very small loans to poor people. Here we learn that giving very small grants to poor people is anti-neoliberal. What I draw from that is that it's very easy to overuse these labels. And in this particular case, I think the idea is so compelling and there's so much to offer that it's probably, better just not to go there. I don't know that we need to bring up these kinds of jibes. And in fact, I think it's interesting that the same, it's said in the book that the Washington-based institutions are distrusting of the poor, and this is one reason that they were opposed to cash transfers. And yet at the same time, they've been pouring money into microcredit, which also involves a lot of trust of the poor and other and microfinance more generally. And I even wonder whether Muhammad Yunus and the microfinance movement deserve some of the credit for the willingness of people now to embrace this set of ideas, because Yunus is a great man, which means he's got both great strengths and great faults. But one of his great contributions is, I think, been just sort of open up this whole idea that the poor can be entrusted, right? That they are markets to be served, not just people to be fixed, if that's the right word. And meanwhile, I also thought of Martin Feldstein, who is perhaps the premier neoliberal of all time and advocated a negative income tax. But let's get to the substance. I see. I got two really important things from this. So I saw two major substantive contributions. The first is that it surveys the evidence on the impacts of microfinance generally, and in particular on this question of when conditioning it works. And I think that's a great service to have done. I would say I would have liked more on the quality of the studies that were invoked. There are a lot of sentences that say this study shows that, this study shows that. 10 years ago, you could have written a book chapter about about all the benefits of microcredit, and you could have said this study shows that it reduces poverty, this study shows that it increases birth weight, and so on. I'm not talking about yours, Nathaniel. And in fact, the problem was that a lot of these studies had methodological issues, and it's now being shown by the randomized trials. So the quality of the studies, I think, is not something to be hidden even from the general public. And my impression, although I don't know, is that in this case, a lot of studies are really good. A lot of randomized trials played a role in spreading this idea in an important way. Unless I missed it, I didn't see that notion being discussed, and I think it's actually quite important. I think another appreciation is that another contribution that I really appreciated is the quite thorough surveying of the ins and outs, the politics, the technology, the financial aspects, the administrative aspects, and the moral ins and outs of all this. And I think that's actually the part the book that I found most interesting and educational, and I think it's really will be good if that reaches a lot of people's eyes, both in the North and in the South. In closing, I would just say that what I think is really the most important thing about this book is that it's got this great straightforward title, and it's transmitting an idea and bringing it to a much larger audience. And I think it's a fundamentally good idea, and so I think I'm glad that you've done the book.
So, David, if you have any responses, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Okay, let's stand up. I don't even 2 or 3 minutes, despite the fact that I've got conversations that go on for weeks here. But let's resist that. I mean, the comments I've found sort of very interesting. With these debates, I mean, one of them certainly is about the use of the term neoliberalism, which often drives me mad from some of my left-wing colleagues in the UK, because we've still got, Marx is not dead and never will be dead in thought, but we still get a lot of recycling sometimes of things that are not particularly useful, and calling everything neoliberal isn't particularly useful. But I suppose one of the things that we could actually follow with cash transfers is the degree to which they are seen as, in a way, social funds, in a way. World Bank social funds. World Bank social funds set back thinking about social policy and cash transfers 10 years. Absolute disaster. It was an absolute joke. I mean, pad scamization, as you remember from Ghana. People in the countries knew that these band-aids of bank social funds were not going to make a difference to the types of massive economic and social problems which even successful sort of structural adjustment would produce. Now, if the cash transfers in a way were feeding in like that, then one could say, they're making a sort of neoliberalism with a human face. But the sorts of sums of money, as you're talking about, that are being transferred, and the commitments suggest that's not the case, and the way that governments are being encouraged to think about how they will share the costs, not simply have a one-off social fund that after 6 years will then not be needed in the economy. So I think it's the degree to which these are seen as the evolution in a way of broader welfare systems, not welfare states or anything that ambitious, because we don't think that ambitiously, I don't think, in Europe nowadays, but that governments have responsibilities for welfare, and they should have sort of dynamic systems that are trying to ensure that citizens achieve their welfare. I think Paul had mentioned about the possibility, with the more detail on local institutions and particularly about the capacity problems in Africa. I think this is where there are really big problems. I mean, what I point people to there is on the Chronic Poverty Research Centre, the CPRC website. We're keeping a log of all the cash transfer and social protection schemes we can keep, with the basic features described on them. And then where you can get data, and also trying to keep a list of evaluations, so it's possible for people to get through to evaluations of different types of scheme if they want to look at them. We're also doing quite a bit of work at my own institute, at the Brooks World Poverty Institute. So I've actually got some grants for it for next year to do more work on the politics of social protection, particularly the focus on Africa and other low-income regions, looking at the way in which domestic elites and politics and interactions from outside are or are not helping those processes to evolve. One of the things we're particularly pleased at CPRC is there's a Livingstone process of Ministers of Social Development meeting, which has met, I think, 2 and is due to meet a 3rd time, to look at cash transfers and social protection in Africa. And that, in a way, is helping to transfer lessons around the continent, but not by them having to come back to London or to Washington and then be recycled after they've been smartened up, but actually for the ministers and their chief technical advisors to meet up together on that. On some of the points that had come up. I think that you raised this question particularly about education and about whether the intergenerational sort of transmission of poverty can or cannot be broken by these sorts of devices. I think maybe if one cautioned it, one say the probability of stopping the transmission of poverty across generations. I think we could argue the evidence indicates that, but it does depend very much on context and on other factors that are happening. And around the world, I mean, I'm horrified to hear it's in Latin America, where I don't work very often, but in Africa and Asia, then educational quality has plummeted in the last 20 years, and certainly in Bangladesh, where I work regularly, in India, where I work quite regularly, then you now have this whole system of education without learning, and you get certificated, but the learning content has just gone, and it is very hard in that sort of context to see what could be done. But I'd say, if we can improve the education system, then the cash transfers will make sure that works together, but it can't work without that. The point on microfinance is something which, I am sort of trying to think about how to follow up these things. What is clear is that cash transfers work deeply and integrate deeply with informal finance and with formal microfinance as much as it happens. Once you have a cash transfer, then it allows you to start thinking about, can you do a whole set of other behaviours. What we're hoping to do at Manchester is to do some sort of social protection portfolios, the portfolios of the poor work that Darryl Collins, Jonathan Mordock, Stuart Rutherford, Orlando Riven did that I was involved in 12 years ago. But we're actually thinking of using those sorts of methods to see if we can look at how people are managing sort of vulnerability and strategy on some sort of basis like that. And there's one or two points that David have made there. The poor laws, it really is fascinating. I'm trying to think what it's called. I think it's History and Policy, WW History and Policy. Is that, can I see Michael Woolcock there? Is it? That's the website? WW History and Policy, website run by some revisionist Cambridge geographers. There's all sorts of great stuff about looking at history and what it says about things we're doing nowadays. But I mean, the arguments on that will argue that actually, the agricultural revolution is usually seen as kicking off the industrial revolution, which kicked off England's growth. But there again, no, it was having a sort of a system of social security, which allowed people to move to the cities without, if things went wrong, losing a basic access to food. That's what allowed, in a way, the rapid urbanization, which allowed the industrialization. So it was that if you want an agricultural and an industrial revolution, first give people a very basic level of security, then they'll start moving and doing the stuff with that. The final thing was about the evidence and the conditions. They say evidence on conditionality and some other things. But I think probably one could say that there has been, I suppose, a change in this last 10 years to the 1990s, and that much of the evidence available at cash transfers is of a much higher quality. I think that's generally because the whole sort of evaluation industry has improved. The random controls help with that, but I also think the qualitative work is done much better now. People lay it down. It's not random conversations, which it might have been. It is structured conversations that are carefully laid down, sometimes available on websites, and that we've got both the quantitative and the qualitative improvements. In Latin America and also in South Asia, you've also got tremendous, actually, domestic capacities too now to do the best quantitative and the best qualitative. So it's no longer got to come out of North America or Europe. You can do it locally at much less the cost, probably to the same or a better standard. Thanks for those. Very good points.
Great rapid fire response. Okay, we already have hands up. Okay, so what we're going to do is take a few questions at a time and not take too many, because I think we're going to go ahead and set up for our reception afterwards, and David's sticking around, and sometimes drinks are more fun. Oh, wait, questions are more fun over drinks. Drinks are more fun over questions. Maybe I've already had a couple. I don't know. Okay, so let's start here, and then you, and then you. So.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
Jane Pratt. Great presentation, great panelists. Thank you, New America. Could you comment about gender? Some of the early studies on direct transfers showed that there were big differences in who got the money. Women tended to spend money more for social benefit purposes than men for personal consumption. Two, a lot of the work I've done a lot of work been involved in direct transfer, both at the World Bank and then later when I created a nonprofit, the Mountain Institute, that deals with remote rural poverty. Where there is no access to market, where there are no markets, then direct cash transfers are really challenging. There you do need to have nonprofits, you need the NGOs, you need different methodology, and it's not trivial. In mountain areas alone, there are 270 million people who live in those areas who do not have access to markets. And third, I just really like the comment that the general application of labels and kind of little jibing really isn't necessary in this, because after you get access to markets, after you get cash, you need education, you need health services, you need technical assistance, and a lot of those are coming from development agencies and NGOs. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Okay, over here. So it's gender, it's what happens when there are no markets, and remote rural poverty. Right here.
Hi, I'm Stephen Schafferman with U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network and the Basic Income Earth Network. And I'm just curious if you're familiar with the work of the Basic Income Earth Network, which is www.basicincome.org. And a lot of the ideas for what you're calling the revolution from the global south were actually seeded by activist academics in the U.S. and Europe. The work in Brazil developed mostly from Senator Eduardo Suplicy, who did his doctorate at Michigan State University in the late 60s, when guaranteed income was a mainstream moderate idea here in the U.S. David Rudman mentioned the negative income tax. Okay. The work in South Africa came out of the Basic Income Earth Network and some of the people there. And so
great. Okay, so
there's a lot more going on here and a lot more history, and also you mentioned the Alaska Permanent Fund, and there are a lot of people actively pushing that.
Yeah, so how much of what we're doing now is based on some lessons and domestically as well? Okay, Pyle. There's here, and then JD afterwards.
Thanks.
And then we'll do a round of responses.
My name is Dorcas Robinson, and I work with CARE. And I just wanted to ask whether I haven't read the book, unfortunately. Amazon emailed me yesterday saying it's finally been shipped after 5 weeks on order. So just so you know. I just wondered how much you had got into the techniques and politics around the notion of graduation. I've been working a lot around CARE's savings-led approach to microfinance in Africa. I'm working now as a policy analyst on food security in Washington. As you can hear, I come from Europe, so I have a very interesting time with my American colleagues when I start talking about how we advocate on social protection. And of course, one of the big things that is coming up for a lot of African governments who are interested, I've been talking to our country teams in Malawi and Rwanda, for example, recently. And what comes up here with the Obama administration, which has made really positive steps in launching Feed the Future initiative, is can we make some connection between giving people grants and them graduating in some way, which of course is a very complex idea in the microfinance history that's been much more focused on graduation to a level of asset, for example, like the PSMP in Ethiopia. But I just wondered to what extent you had touched on that issue or might be thinking more about that issue moving forward, because I think the more we understand the different kinds of poverty, the different kinds of groups that we're looking at, it becomes clear that we have groups of people who, from a rights-based perspective, the old age pension, for example, you would agree, need a long-term regular income. But other groups that politicians would be more likely to say, well, they should be graduated. And of course, that's a very complex technical and political argument.
Great, thanks. And JD.
I'm JD Van Pischke, and I and the speaker have been around for a long time. And I always appreciate his work. We are social scientists, both. He at the very positive social end, and I at the financial side, where constructive pessimism is probably, it should be taken seriously, I guess. I think the last speaker's comments were very good. I would add, who is the marginal recipient, and how is that determined? Also, again, if we have transaction costs, I think the IDB speaker gave us some information on the transaction costs of these things. And then clearly corruption. Again, it's been touched, but certainly the countries that are most in need of this wonderful thing are the ones that are most likely to screw it up. The wealthy or someone else will get the thing. So informations and incentives, I think we're doing well, and I wish you well, David.
Right. Monique, is your question quick, or should we do a round first?
Since the microphone's here.
Really
we'll be
quickly.
quick.
Please.
Monique Cohen from Microfinance Opportunity. It's wonderful to hear you, David. I just want to ask you a question on people manage money wisely. What is the criteria that you use around managing money wisely? We run a global financial education program, and we get a number of calls from people who do conditional cash transfers, asking us to help them design a program to help people better use formal financial services and link to conditional cash transfers. So I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Monique. So, David, let's start with you. Why don't you address a few and then let others who might have a couple of thoughts, a couple of responses. I think you could just talk right into it. It should be
Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks for those very interesting points and questions, only parts of which I can answer. On the gender, I mean, certainly I think the evidence that we came across when amassing it for the book tended to go to confirm the argument that that when the cash goes to women, it's more likely that it will go into food, health and education, and the other forms of activities that men might think about are not so likely to happen. That may be because of women's behaviour, it may be because of the social construction of what being a woman or a wife or a mother is, and that may be different than being one of the boys being able to spend it on booze and the opportunities that travel and that creates for males, but it would tend to move in that way. In terms of remote rural areas, I think they are a challenge for cash transfers, as they're an incredible challenge for microfinance and most other things. And I suppose the key question on that would be whether to hammer away on other issues that one thinks might do more, such as infrastructure and political and social recognition and languages and that, or whether to sort of try and ensure that cash transfers are incorporated into what's happening. And I would probably need to think that through a lot, but I tend to think of integrating them through. I mean, one of the opportunities that one sees potentially for cash transfers, if you've got them, which I'm not sure how well it's working now in South Africa. It was certainly written about quite a bit in the in the middle 2000, around 2004, 2005, was using a monthly cash transfer event to create a market in relatively stagnant rural areas. So actually, you actually get the money distributed, people can bring their produce, and a whole set of things can happen. So in a way, at least once a month, there is a sort of kick of dynamism into the into remote rural economies, so using them as a focus, and you bring the doctors and education and a whole set of other services around at that time. With Stephen, and with basic income, I'm not sure whether in the UK we probably have linked in with what's been coming here. We've had guys standing, ramming it down our throats for very much in that. Partly because Guy's a great guy, but it's such a fundamentalist position. You have to have a global basic income or everything else is crap. That really hasn't actually helped some arguments. It certainly hasn't with policymakers at DFID and at the EU, talking with them about how they fit them in, being told there's this one gold standard and everything else is an abomination. I mean, it has its place in some arguments, but in many arguments that doesn't particularly help. Interestingly, I mean, the other place where we've come across it, particularly in South Africa, where the big debates about whether there should be a basic income grant, and that's whether every South African citizen should get a monthly grant from the government of the same size. And certainly we were involved in those conversations and suggesting that the VAT that would need to be raised to put it on, could be called or I can call it VAT, you'd call it the solidarity tax. And it's to try and glue this broken sort of nation together after apartheid with that. Interestingly, I think the conclusion on that in South Africa was to stick with the pensions and the child support grants. A whole series of arguments, but some arguing that if you've got administrative systems that are part working, then it's a great risk to maybe tinker with them to move to something else. But a whole set of arguments going on there. Dorcas, were you doing your PhD at the Open University? Yeah, no. It was. I was in Bangladesh, which is why I couldn't be internal examiner. I was trying to work out the graduation. Interestingly, I mean, graduation, that sort of idea doesn't is not used, certainly in the literature that I've looked at on cash transfers and social protection, in the way that it is in microfinance and also on asset transfers, the sort of things that I'm looking at in Bangladesh, where you do find graduation fits into that a lot. I mean, one of the, I think it does need to be thought about. I mean, how it does actually fit into these sorts of programs is that when you've got targeting is with the question of, so what do we do with people who've done well? When we're really successful and people do all these wonderful things, how do we take them off the program? How do you tell people, well, we're pleased you've done well and that? That is it's not really a part of the literature we've looked at, but that must be emerging in Latin America, one would assume, with the sort of success rates that have been reported and the sort of targeting criteria around that people have actually begun to move over. I still wonder about this idea of graduation, because I think it works well for academia maybe. But I wonder whether something like social mobility or security is a better sort of concept, because I'm not sure that anybody ever sort of graduates from vulnerability. Certainly reaching a stage in life where my parents or the parents are sort of are getting old and that, then you can have cash in the bank, but you're highly vulnerable and need forms of support. So I mean, the sort of finality of graduation, I'm not sure whether that is a useful idea. I sort of like the idea of, how do you ensure security for people and maintain that security throughout the life cycle and as things change there. JD always asking me a difficult question as we look from different disciplinary perspectives and probably different ideological perspectives too, as I think I remember finding out in Hamburg many years ago when you explained to me what human rights really were, I think, which was the right to contract and the right to your body. That's what you told me that day, yeah. I think I'd been preaching pretty broad, but I remember you brought me down to the ground and gave me a minimalist point on that. But I mean, on transaction costs, there is certainly, quite a lot of the data, which is not coming to mind now, but data looking at that, both working out how do you deliver these things efficiently, but how do you also make sure that you're not imposing such costs on people that these become unreasonable. And that's where some of the conditionality questions begin to come in, and particularly the ideas about parental training and this, about whether you're insisting that people go to things, but actually the mechanism is not going to change those behaviours with it. In terms of corruption, and that's a problem everywhere, and it is unfortunately the case that particularly in poorer countries, then leakage levels are likely to be higher. I mean, I think the key thing is not to throw up your hands and despair. In Bangladesh, certainly with food for work programs, it used to be 40% leakage, but it was managed to be kept at that or managed under that. Was that good? No. But did the 60% that get through improve people's lives, managing to keep children sort of partially nourished? Then yes. So I mean, I think one has to be deeply concerned about corruption and look for ways of trying to reduce it. I mean, some of the technological changes may make identification much easier than it has been in the past, as long as we don't get carried away with technologies that shift money into electronic accounts, which might be taking it too far. And certainly in Africa, where quite a lot of our work at Manchester's based, then we're still seeing, whilst we warn against pilot schemes being practiced too much there, then, I mean, scaling up to massive scale cash transfer schemes before there is a reasonable evidence base behind them would seem unwise in these sorts of environments. One is clearly going to have to work out how things might move forward. But I think, I mean, there are things that can be looked at. Certainly, I mean, I think pensions is a great thing. Certainly in Bangladesh, the sort of limited amounts of field work I've done there on pensions suggests that, there is this moral economy of corrupt local level officials, and taking money from very old ladies is seen as different from taking it from poor households who've got a male head to them, and there are a whole set of devices. So if one could start off finding those sorts of devices which actually there is a moral economy around them, and then move into other devices but try and transfer those sorts of levels of those lower levels of corruption to them. So I think that might be some ways forward. On pessimism, I forgot to mention my book on global poverty, one copy of which is out there, which I'm going to launch in New York tomorrow. But I shifted to international relations the last couple of years. When you get into international relations, it's really pessimistic there. When you read all these things that powerful and wealthy people say in that, it's just so refreshing to be able to talk to poor people and hear about their strategies and what they're doing than these global bullshitters. But that's a different tale.
Great, very generously addressed, I think, every single question in 5 minutes.
Sorry.
It's really great. No, it's wonderful. But can we just get a 2-minute final thoughts from each of the other panelists, and then we'll go into reception.
Actually, I have nothing to add except for JD's comment is really resonating with me, and I'm not sure whether we've... not the one about human rights. But the idea that those countries which need the program most would be least likely to implement it. I mean, I work a lot on Nigeria, which is quite a unique country, but has a number of problems which are not unique to the world. And actually, every election is a massive cash transfer process. And I'm just trying to think how those elements of... I'm not being totally cynical there. Those elements of patronage and social solidarity which actually operate in that system can be made to operate more for the poor. That's a parting thought. I'm sure David can work it out in his next book.
But quite a lot of those aren't captured sufficiently by policy. They're sort of outside of policy almost.
The transfers?
The transfers.
Very much outside policy. Yes.
Well, I think enough has been said. I would just say that we actually have done a little bit of work, we the bank, at the corruption question. And the good news is that because there's no procurement that goes with this, there are many fewer opportunities for corruption. And a little bit different than what David was saying, we actually like the idea of electronic accounts. I don't know if you meant it the same way, because, again, if an entity is simply transferring cash directly into people's accounts, there's no one, again, in the middle on the corruption side. What we have looked at also is, where do these programs sit in the bureaucracy, and are they being used to influence peddle? I guess a word, perhaps not the politically correct way to have said that, but and we do see that in many countries they actually sit in the presidencia. That having been said, we haven't really seen that they've been abused, misused in our region on the influence side of things. Now, they're probably better off sitting somewhere else than in the president's office, so to speak. But we haven't seen the attendant use of the cash transfers in an influence way that really would concern us. So that's another perspective on the corruption side, I think.
Mm-hmm. My comment is similar. Thinking about JD's question about corruption, no question that a malignant, a malign government can obstruct this or corrupt it. But it does. There is some good news, which points to a theme that actually I think I would have given more prominence in the book, although it is in there, which is the positive contribution that technology can make in combating corruption. What I was bringing up a New York Times story on here from last month about a debate going on in India right now about whether to shift from in-kind delivery of food to providing vouchers. Now, vouchers can be, grabbed by middlemen, people in local officials and sold, and they can be co-opted by corruption. But of course, India is also developing a national ID system, which is going to give everybody a smart card, which is going to be connected to both their fingerprints and their retinas. And so one can imagine, and I would think this is being considered, that the food distribution system can be linked to that, so that only the person with a certain retina, and everybody's retina is unique, can actually cash in a voucher for food. And so that then shows how technology can combat corruption, and I think it's a pretty broad theme in a lot of these programs.
I think what we're going to do is close it up here, but if you do, I'm sure there are others with questions. So David and I think maybe a couple of the panelists are sticking around, so please feel free to come up and ask additional questions over a drink and some food. Thank you guys very much for your time and your thoughtful comments, contributions, and I'll look forward to seeing where all of this goes. I think it's exciting, lots of potential. Thanks a lot.